Quantitative easing was a tool that the Fed introduced at the height of the Great Recession. Like conventional monetary policy, the purpose of the tool was to affect credit costs. At the time, the conventional tool, short-term interest rates, was sort of reaching its capacity because interest rates were at the zero lower bound. The Fed can no longer reduce credit costs by reducing short-term interest rates. So they turned to QE, which, similar to conventional policy, involves affecting credit costs, but it's focused more on long-term rates, affecting long-term government bond rates, and also affecting the rates on private securities, such as mortgages, relative to long-term government bond rates. And in particular, what happened is in December of 2008, at the height of the crisis, the Fed announced that it would begin buying mortgage-backed securities. And what you saw, and they would begin in the following spring in 2009. And what you saw was immediately mortgage rates fell in anticipation of this bond buying program. Now, the reason it was so effective was because the private intermediation, the private markets that were funding these mortgage-backed securities were in disarray. This was the investment banks like Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and so on. They were funding these kinds of securities with short-term debt. But suddenly, because they were experiencing defaults on these securities, they were losing their credit worthiness and no longer able to fund them. So you can think of QE as the Fed stepping in as an investment bank or as a hedge fund. What did they do? They issued interest-bearing reserves, short-term debt, and they purchased these securities. And by purchasing the securities, they increased the price and lowered the rate. So it's really the Fed stepping in as a financial intermediary. QE involves the Fed expanding the size of its balance sheet. So it bought all of these assets, government bonds, private securities, and they funded them by issuing reserves. So what happened is the Fed's balance sheet grew from about $1 trillion to about $3 to $4 trillion. And because its liabilities, its reserves were growing so much, there was concern that this would lead to rapid inflation. But the confusion is that QE affects inflation the same way conventional policy affects inflation. And that is, conventional policy, you reduce interest rates, you stimulate the economy, and inflation picks up. Same thing with QE. If QE reduces long-term rates, that stimulates the economy and inflation picks up. And typically, these forces aren't dramatic in the short term in terms of the impact on inflation. And that's what we saw. QE was able to reduce long rates a bit. That helped stimulate the economy. And that helped actually keep inflation from falling because there were strong deflationary forces in the economy. But the accommodative monetary policy kept inflation from turning into deflation. The private sector now understands that the Fed has this tool. So if we were to find ourselves in the same kind of situation where stress in financial markets, that now the Fed has this tool. And I think just the knowledge that they have the tool will help calm financial markets.